It's been a while since I've been able to get over to the shop and forge something, and I wanted to make a knife. And, well, I had some leftover Damascus from when I made my round knife. And as you can see, I'm off to a great start. But we'll heat that back up, we'll grab a different pair of tongs and try again. And I'm starting with a piece of steel that's about a 1/4 inch thick, an inch and a half wide, and about 6 inches long. And I'm starting by shaping the tang first, the handle of the knife. And I'm hoping to be able to draw it out to about 3.5 to 4 inches for the handle and make about a 3 or 4 inch blade. I get pretty close to that. I wind up with about 3.5 inch on the handle and about 3.5 on the blade. Maybe a little bit more. There's kind of a ricasso in between. If you count that, then the blade's probably 4, but it's still only got a 3.5 inch cutting edge. And I have a wooden pattern that I made up ahead of time. Just took a 2x4 and cut it to shape on the bandsaw and sanded on it and ground on it a little bit until it was comfortable in my hand. I actually don't remember how many layers this particular Damascus billet had in it. I think it was 36, but I'm not positive about that. But I remember it has 3 different pieces of steel in it. I'd have to go back to the round knife video to check that out and see exactly what I did with it. It's been almost 8 or 9 months since I've done it. Here I'm drawing just a little bit wider and kind of tapering the tang a little bit while I'm doing it, just to get that shape that I wanted. I don't quite put as much curve in it as I was originally planning. I leave it a little bit straighter than it was. It still turns out really nice. It's got a little bit of a curve, but not much. It always helps to straighten everything out as you're going a little bit too, and try and keep it straight from the very start. Now that I'm happy with the tang of it, I'm going to switch it around and start drawing out a blade. I'm still not very good at forging a tip out on a blade without getting a fish mouth on it. I'm working on that particular technique, but I always seem to get a little bit of a problem that could become a cold shut. So on this one, I decided to just draw it out until I'm getting close and count on grinding the tip in a little bit after I've got it mostly to shape. But I just want to forge on it some and pull that out to get a little bit more length out of it. As I said, I started with a 6-inch piece of steel, and I want a knife that overall length is going to be closer to 7 or 7.5. That's one of the great things about forging, is that you can be a little cheap about your steel and stretch it out a little bit. And since this is just a random pattern Damascus, forging to shape only makes it better, as it changes the layers a little bit more. I'm also going to forge in just a little bit of a taper to the blade. Again, get a little bit more length out of it, but also just makes the blade that much nicer to use when it's got a little bit of a distal taper to it. And it's sort of one of those hallmarks of a forged blade. It's something that's much easier to do in a forged blade, I think, than to grind it in. I'm not going to actually forge in much of the bevels. Because again, this random pattern Damascus, it actually will probably look a little bit better if I grind more into it and grind away some of the layers, expose more of the layers. If I forged them in, I'd probably mostly see the outer layers. You'd get a little bit, but you see more of them if you grind the bevels in a little bit more. And at this point, I'm just going to try and flatten everything out a little bit. It's really too cool to forge, but you can straighten and flatten while it's still this is actually a really dull red heat. It looks black in the video, but it still has a little bit of color to it, and that's a good time to straighten. Then I'm going to go ahead and start grinding. And I'll start with grinding to profile, and then grinding in the bevels, and I'll just start by hogging off material with a 36 grit belt, a brand new one. And I've kind of drawn a line on there, a profile line with a Sharpie marker, where I want to grind, what I want to grind off for the back and the tip and so on. And I do try and keep it cool while I'm doing this, not because I think it matters that much on the steel itself because it hasn't been hardened yet, but just because then I can handle it easily if I keep it cool. And once I've got the profile around the handle in and across the spine, I'll work a little bit more on the blade and the spine and get it to shape. Especially that tip, like I said, I've got to grind in a good bit on the tip. But after we've got it pretty much ground to profile, then we'll go ahead and grind in the bevels. Well, we'll flatten the sides and then grind in the bevels after we've got the sides of the tank flat. Once I've got everything ground into shape and the bevels ground in, I'll start cleaning it up with a 120 grit belt and smoothing everything out. I'll do quite a bit of grinding with a 120 grit belt a lot of times too, because You only want to get so close with the 36, it leaves deep scratches. The 120 doesn't leave nearly as deep as scratches, so if you grind quite a bit off with it, then you'll end up with a smoother finish. And once I've got it all cleaned up with the 120 and looking like, just 120 grit scratches instead of 36 grit scratches on it, on the tang, the spine, I'm going to go ahead and do the whole thing before I get to it, which is hardly ever really. Forget about that and later for forgetting about it. I'll countersink them just a little bit. Into the hole. Easier to get the pins through. And then we're going on to heat treat. And I will, for this knife, and usually what I do is I'll heat it up until it gets to that nice color, that non-magnetic color. And then I'll take and let it cool off and thermal cycle it 3 times. All the way back to black, back up to color, all the way back to black. And I'll keep turning it around and pulling it in and out of the forge as I heat it to try and get an even color all the way across, from the tip and the edge all the way out. And once I've got that done, I'll go ahead and get it in the oil. It actually caught fire because the tongs were hot right there. And they were outside of the oil. The reaction I had where I jumped back is the natural reaction, but really what's best is to put it in the oil to get it to go out. Well, then it's back to the grinder to clean everything up. 120 grit belt, the small wheel attachment with the 120, and then I'm going to go to a 220. And then I was planning on doing 400, but I just completely forgot about it. I had some Cubitron belts I was going to use, but I forgot about it, and I just went straight to the surface conditioning belt. And it came out with a really nice finish just from that, from the 220, or maybe it was a 240 belt, and then onto the surface conditioning. Okay, back over at the house, and checking this out, I threw it in the oven to temper it for a couple hours at 375, and it's got a real light straw temper to it. Not sure how well the camera is going to pick up that color, because it's hard to see in this light. There's one problem with the tang. It's got a bit of a bump right here that I didn't quite get it all flattened out. I may try just flattening it out on my slab with some sandpaper. And I think I'm going to take some real fine sandpaper and just polish off the oxides from the tempering. I'm not even going to try and get too much into the removing scratches, I don't think, on it. Because I sort of like the finish that it's got. And then we'll go ahead and take it, put it in the etch, and get it etched up so we can see the Damascus pattern. But first, the etch was in, I don't know, a couple cycles about 5 minutes long, and then one about 20 minutes long. I etch it until I can feel a raised surface on it. And you can see kind of the pattern. I'm going to throw out some coffee to darken this up. Now, I've heard people call this a coffee etch, and I'm not entirely sure that's an accurate term. I'm not sure it's actually an etch. I think it is actually just coloring it. I think it is just darkening up the oxides that are left over from the etch. And I have a reason for thinking that. Because, as a leather worker, this is a known reaction. That you can darken a piece of leather by leaving a piece of iron on it. And that is because the tannins in the leather, tannic acid, reacts with the iron and some oxygen in the air and forms a dark pigment. It's such a well-known thing among leather workers that they have what they call vinegaroon, which is this soft-colored, rusty, sort of yellowish solution. Basically, you just dissolve iron, you dissolve steel wool in some vinegar, and you come up with something that is kind of a little bit of a magic trick. You put the leather in it, and it doesn't darken right away. It takes a minute. It has to soak in, and the reaction has to happen over time, and you got to dip it several times usually to get a nice dark color. And after you neutralize it, let it dry, and all of that, then you go back and oil it. And you won't get a real solid black. Sometimes you can get a pretty good black, especially when it's fresh. But you can get a fairly dark color that somebody would refer to as black. As long as they don't put next to something that's a good black dye was used for. And like I said, it's a chemical reaction between tannins, which is what makes coffee brown. It's the acidic taste in coffee. And it's also what tans leather. Different tannins, but they're the same type of chemical, and they have a similar reaction. Okay, so it's actually a couple days later. I left it in a coffee etch overnight, and you can see it got really dark as the coffee tannins bonded with those iron oxides. You can see the 15 and 20 layers show up, but the other layers not so much. Another interesting note, you can see on the tang that the pattern kind of fades out and muddies a little bit, gets a little bit more indistinct, somewhere right around in here. That's because I hardened most of the blade, but this part didn't go down in the oil. So I was trying not to harden up to this hole because didn't really want it to be hardened all the way across the tang, but it doesn't hurt because I already have the hole there. That's why you drill them ahead of time, is in case you go too far into the oil and you harden this steel. But anyway, I'm going to use a little bit of, it's just mineral oil and beeswax that I use as kind of a finish. Just to sort of oil this up a little bit before I tape it up and try to put some handle scales on it. And that also can help to bring out a few of the other tones in it, and it makes the black a little bit blacker. You gotta remember to clean it off with your tang whenever you're going to go and epoxy everything together, though, because that wax can keep the epoxy from sticking. There we go. Trying to find that sweet spot where you can actually see the reflection of the pattern. Okay, so I skipped ahead a few steps here. Just didn't feel like filming all of it. Pretty much didn't want to take the camera over to the shop. But I went over to the shop, cut out a piece of curly maple, and made some scales out of it. Shaped them, hand sanded them, dyed them with a brown leather dye. And these are the scales I wound up with. So, they're going to look pretty good on the knife. Now we're all ready for gluing it up. I also went and re-etched the spine of the knife along the handle because there were spots that I caught it with the sander while I was shaping the scales, because I had them on there just pinned in place to shape them. I haven't found a really good way to do that yet and not have to re-etch. I could do it before I etch, but then everything winds up just a little off anyway, and so I'll have to find a better way. perfect. It is a knife that I am pretty proud of. The steel is the same billet of steel that I made my round knife out of almost a year ago now, actually, or at least 8 or 9 months ago. And it came out looking excellent as expected. The handle is, as I think I just mentioned, some curly maple, which one of my favorite woods because of the way that it changes depending on how the light hits it as to where the stripes are in the grain. You've got where you can see the stripes down the spine and the lines of the Damascus are down the spine. The couple things that I know I did wrong, I put some dents in it whenever I was putting the pins back in. There's a couple dents in there that I can definitely do better on that in the future. There's some kind of sharpish edges that shouldn't be as sharp as they are. So things that I could improve on. But I do like the blade shape. I do like the handle shape and the way it feels in the hand. And of course, it's a good functional knife. It's a nice, nice size utility type knife. And as far as being sharp, everybody always shows cutting paper, which I don't think is a great test. It could just be because I'm really bad at cutting paper with a knife, but this one does just fine at it. But I really like to cut pieces of leather with a knife because I cut a lot of leather, so I know what it should feel like, what it should sound like when it cuts through. So a good sharp knife on a piece of leather this is a moderately hard to cut piece of leather. It's not super hard, but you can hear it doesn't make much noise when it goes through. No ripping and tearing sounds. And it does skive pieces. And that's always how I test to see if a knife is sharp.